The contents were wild. It announced a new non-binding civic advisory group whose purpose was to reimagine harmonious aesthetics and assist non-compliant homeowners in transitioning toward communal excellence. In the middle of the pamphlet was a column called Spotlight on Resistance featuring a blurry photo of me raking leaves. The caption read, "Even well-meaning individuals may unknowingly contribute to neighborhood decay." I didn't know whether to laugh or call a therapist. She had essentially created a shadow government that existed only in laminated literature and recycled buzzwords. I thought maybe she was just venting, reaching for attention in a way that would quickly burn out. But then came the podcast. Yes, Karen had a podcast. I wouldn't have believed it if I hadn't heard it myself. A neighbor sent me the link, which opened with a theme song that sounded like royalty-free military trumpet music. The podcast was called Voices of Order. And in the first episode, Karen spent 20 minutes recounting her version of our conflict. She spoke in hushed, dramatic tones, described her failed HOA as a vision dismantled by suburban anarchy, and said she hoped to inspire others across the nation who suffered from rogue neighbors, fence rebels, and mailbox miscreants. She called me the man in blue, referencing my house color like I was some elusive urban legend. I sat in stunned silence, earbuds in, wondering how I had become the villain in someone's personal saga about community structure. She had invented an entire mythos around our feud, complete with code names and ideological slogans. But what made it worse was that people started listening. Her follower count rose. Comments appeared. Some people seemed amused. Others genuinely sympathized. And that's when I knew the story wasn't over. I reached out to Lexi again. We reviewed the court's order and confirmed that as long as she didn't contact me directly or misrepresent her group as a legal HOA, she wasn't technically in violation. It was maddening. She could make up organizations and drop propaganda under the guise of personal expression as long as it wasn't framed as binding or official. But I refused to let it control my life again. I decided to fight back. Not in court, not through escalation, but through presence. I went on the same local news station that aired her clip. With Lexi beside me, I told my side of the story. Calm, measured, factual. I explained the fake citations, the lawsuit, the absurd flyers and signs and flags. I brought printed evidence, played dashcam footage, showed the deed proving my exemption, and then without naming her. I said, community isn't about power or control. It's about respect, and sometimes respecting your neighbor means leaving them alone. The interviewer nodded and said, sounds like you've been through quite the journey. And I just smiled. I've learned a lot about what not to do when welcoming someone new to the block. The segment aired and got more traction than I expected. Neighbors I hadn't even spoken to before waved from across the street or dropped off cards that said things like, thanks for standing up, or, we believe you. Even the mailman gave me a thumbs up and joked that my mailbox had become a local landmark. But Karen didn't take kindly to my moment of vindication. Within 48 hours, she released a special podcast episode titled The Retaliation of Disorder, in which she accused unnamed figures of manipulating media, weaponizing legal institutions, and attacking her right to curate neighborhood spirit. But this time, something had changed. The comments were no longer unanimous support. Some asked questions, others challenged her claims. One wrote, "Why are you still fixated on this guy?" Another simply said, "Maybe let it go." The tide was turning. Still, Karen being Karen, she decided to up the ante in a way that felt more desperate than strategic. One afternoon, I noticed a woman setting up a folding table at the park at the end of our street. It was Karen. On the table were piles of her laminated pamphlets, some cookies, and a sign that read Community Realignment Discussion. It looked like a yard sale of bad ideas. Only a handful of people approached her, mostly out of confusion. I strolled past on a walk with my dog and gave her a simple nod. She didn't look at me, didn't say anything. Her eyes were on the sidewalk. A man approached her, took one of the pamphlets, read it for a moment, then handed it back, and said something I couldn't hear. She packed up 10 minutes later. It was over before it began. After that, things went quiet again. For real, this time, the flyers stopped. The podcast episodes became infrequent. No more flags, no more civic restoration rallies, or summit invitations. Her cape disappeared. Her lawn went unkempt for the first time. It was as if something inside her had finally relented, accepted that the fantasy could only survive for so long without an audience. And in the vacuum left by her absence, something amazing began to happen. The neighborhood came alive. People planned events together, but casually, without formality or pressure. Kids drew chalk rainbows on the sidewalks without fear of a citation. One neighbor planted wild flowers instead of manicured hedges. Another painted their front door teal. And no one said a word about it. It became a place of color and quirks and laughter, exactly what it should have been all along. It was late spring by the time the final thread of Karen's strange crusade unraveled. The air had taken on that mellow kind of warmth that made porch sitting irresistible, and the dogwood trees swayed with casual elegance along the sidewalks. My lawn had started to bloom in uneven bursts of color, wild violets, some rogue daisies, and patches of what I now proudly called organic landscaping. I was sipping iced tea on the porch one lazy Sunday when I noticed something peculiar. Karen was in her front yard, not pacing or measuring or lecturing, but pulling weeds quietly. No clipboard, no pamphlets, no signage, just gloves, a trash bag, and silence. It didn't feel triumphant to watch her fold back into the background. It felt strange, like seeing a once loud radio finally go static. For all the drama and madness she had stirred, this quiet scene was the first time she ever looked like a neighbor and not a storm. But just as I began to accept the return to normalcy, the mail brought me one final surprise. A letter not from Karen but from a legal office representing a media production company. She even added a clause about elective decor evaluations. I stared at the paper, then at the sky, and wondered how someone could lose so publicly and still find the energy to draft a constitution in Microsoft Word. But the most unbelievable part was that she was planning to vote herself into leadership again at an emergency civic summit scheduled for Saturday right in her driveway. That same afternoon, Diane and a few other neighbors stopped by to tell me they'd received identical flyers. Most were laughing, but a few looked uneasy. One man, James, said she showed up at my door holding a clipboard and asked if I supported dignity. Another neighbor said she was told that refusing to participate could result in being listed as detrimental to neighborhood morale. I knew that tone. Karen wasn't just regrouping. She was rebranding with a vengeance, trying to wrap the same madness in a shinier bow. But this time she was doing it after a legal gag order had been placed on her, barring her from contacting me or representing any formal HOA organization. What she was doing now may have had a new name, but the playbook hadn't changed. She was still trying to intimidate, still printing demands, still trying to wrangle control of people who just wanted to be left alone. I called Lexi, who by now had an entire folder on her laptop labeled Karen's Greatest Hits. After reading the flyer, Lexi said, "This qualifies as a violation of the injunction. She's using the same tactics under a different name and targeting the same community. If she pushes the summit, we can bring her back to court. And this time, she won't walk away with just a warning." I told her to proceed. Meanwhile, I started noticing strange things popping up around the neighborhood. Small white flags planted near driveways with tiny handwritten notes attached that read things like Ally of Order or Certified Compliant. I found one at the base of my mailbox and immediately tossed it in the trash. Later that night, my doorbell rang, and when I checked the porch camera, there was a middle-aged man I didn't recognize holding a clipboard, shifting from foot to foot. He didn't knock or speak. He just stood there for nearly 3 minutes, looking back and forth before leaving. The next day, someone had taped a note to my trash bin that read, "Non-cooperative behavior breeds chaos." I filed it all. Lexi advised me to stay steady and let the evidence build. Karen wasn't just ignoring the court order. She was accelerating her tactics. And it was only a matter of time before she crossed a legal line she couldn't explain away with buzzwords. Saturday arrived with an almost comical mix of tension and absurdity. Karen's driveway summit began with lawn chairs arranged in rows, a Bluetooth speaker blasting orchestral music, and a homemade podium made from stacked moving boxes covered in fabric. She wore a white sash, this time with the words, "Acting Civic Regent," printed in gold glitter letters. About 10 people showed up, most of them curious or bewildered. She began by reading a prepared speech about the erosion of decency and reclaiming structured living. Halfway through, she introduced a list of new recommended lifestyle adjustments, including weekly fence inspections, seasonal porch theme alignment, and biannual garden virtue audits. I could see everything from my front window, sipping coffee, and recording it all. Then she made her biggest mistake. She picked up a new stack of flyers and began distributing them to attendees, encouraging them to tape copies to neighbors' doors. These flyers listed me by name again, accused me of leading a campaign of neighborhood disruption, and called for formal reevaluation of exclusionary residents. I took one look, walked inside, and handed the footage to Lexi. Her email back simply said, "She's done." We filed an emergency motion that same day. By Monday, Karen was served with a court summon for violation of the injunction, harassment, and contempt of court. When the deputy arrived to serve her, she refused to open the door, shouted through the screen that she was being spiritually oppressed, and then proceeded to film him with her phone while narrating a monologue about community collapse. The video naturally ended up on the neighborhood Facebook page, and comments ranged from confusion to outright comedy. One person wrote, "If I wear mismatched socks, will the Civic Preservation League charge me with treason?" Another posted a photo of their dog wearing a sign that said, "Uncertified paw behavior." It was the turning point. The ridicule had finally outweighed the fear. At the follow-up hearing, Karen came in wearing a cape. An actual navy blue cape, along with oversized sunglasses and a stack of printed charts. She claimed her new organization was a non-political lifestyle collective and therefore not subject to the injunction. The judge didn't even let her finish. He issued a formal cease and desist order, fined her for contempt, and referred her case to the district attorney for review of fraudulent conduct. He also stated that any further attempts to establish a governing body without proper registration would result in criminal charges. As we left the courthouse, Karen stood outside with her cape flapping in the wind, muttering to herself and clutching a clipboard like it was a teddy bear. She didn't speak to the cameras this time. She didn't speak to anyone. That evening, the neighborhood felt different, calmer, brighter. Several people came by to thank me, not because I'd fought back, but because they finally felt like they could breathe. The flags vanished from lawns. The flyers stopped. People started organizing their own small gatherings free of surveillance or regulation. Diane brought by another pie. You finally got her to shut up, she said, smiling. You might be a local hero. I laughed, though part of me knew better than to declare total victory. Karen wasn't. I should have known Karen wouldn't fade into obscurity with grace. For most people, a public courtroom loss, a judge's formal cease and desist, and the complete collapse of a fantasy organization would have served as a natural stopping point. But Karen didn't operate under the logic most of us use to navigate life. No, she saw humiliation not as an ending, but as an opportunity to spin a new narrative, one where she wasn't defeated. She was persecuted. I first learned of her latest stunt from a local news segment someone forwarded to me. It was a low-budget special on unfavorably neighborhoods featuring dramatic music, slow pans of my block, and of course, Karen standing in front of her porch with an American flag behind her and her now infamous cape neatly draped over one shoulder. The chair under her name read, Community Advocate and former HOA Visionary. I nearly spit my coffee. She was claiming that her efforts to organize the neighborhood were met with hostility and legal overreach, framing herself as a local martyr for civility. She even said, I never wanted control. I only wanted peace. But certain individuals couldn't handle structure. She didn't name me directly, but the camera did pan to my house twice, including a dramatic shot of my mailbox, while violins swelled in the background. Lexi found it hilarious. I found it exhausting, but the news clip was only the beginning. A few days later, Karen's latest invention hit my front lawn. A laminated pamphlet titled The Independent Council for Neighborhood Restoration, folded neatly and placed under a smooth stone on my welcome mat. Like a weird adult version of trick-or-treating. I didn't want to just respond. I wanted to end this war once and for all, and not with retaliation, with clarity. I decided to use the cookout as a chance to show the neighborhood who I really was. Not the villain Karen had described in her flyers, but just a guy who moved in looking for peace and got ambushed by a walking rules manual with too much free time. So, I set up a grill, a table of snacks, folding chairs, a lemonade station, even a bubble machine for the kids. I went house to house with small printed invites, kept it friendly. Didn't mention Karen once. When Saturday came, I expected maybe 5 or 6 people to show up. Instead, nearly the whole block came out. Kids ran across the lawn with sticky fingers. Dogs sniffed each other under the grill, and adults brought overcovered dishes and lawn games. Diane brought another pie, this time, peach. An older couple arrived with a bucket of cold sodas and said they hadn't been to a gathering in over a year. It's like the neighborhood woke up, one of them said to me. I smiled even though I was constantly checking the corner of my eye, waiting for the inevitable storm in a blazer. Karen didn't show up until the sun was already low. She parked her car diagonally across my driveway and emerged holding a clipboard and a speakerphone. Yes, a speakerphone. She turned it on and it emitted a screech before she barked. This gathering is unauthorized and in direct violation of Section 6, Clause B, Unregulated Congregations. People turned to stare. Popsicles paused mid-bite. I heard a lawn chair creak as someone shifted nervously, but no one moved. Karen marched up to the lemonade table and pointed at the bubble machine. Environmental hazard, she declared. Then at the grill, fire risk, then at me. instigating further community disorder. This ends tonight. I looked her in the eye, then turned to the crowd and said, "Hey, who wants peach pie?" The shift was instant. Laughter broke the tension. Someone started clapping. A kid ran through a bubble cloud. Karen stood there frozen, humiliated, and then turned sharply and walked back to her car. The driveway scraped as she backed out crookedly and drove off without another word. That night, several neighbors stayed late, helping me pack up. Some staying to chat about her. About the past year, about how they'd felt trapped by her weird little regime. A few even admitted they'd paid fake dues, confused and intimidated by her threat. One man told me she made it seem like she had the county behind her. I didn't want trouble. It became clear Karen hadn't just targeted me. She'd built an empire out of misdirection and social pressure. So I asked Lexi, what happens if we don't just fight her behavior, but challenge the entire structure she's pretending exists? Lexi's eyes lit up. If she's collecting money under false pretenses and presenting herself as a legal authority, that's fraud. If she's issuing fake citations and invoices, that's mail fraud. If she's trespassing and tampering with property, we've got harassment, vandalism, and criminal mischief. We can take this further. I told her to do it. A few days later, we filed an official civil suit, not just against Karen as a neighbor, but against her self-created HOA shell for impersonation, fraud, and harassment. We submitted a compiled packet of evidence, camera footage, photos of flyers, copies of her forged invoices, even a digital copy of the bogus shutter conformity notice. We listed every incident, every moment of overreach, and every time she'd targeted someone on the block with her fictional authority. The sheriff's office confirmed that her HOA was not registered with the county and never had been. That alone invalidated every document she'd ever sent. But we weren't stopping there. Lexi wanted a public declaration from the court that Karen's association was null and void and that I had legal immunity from her ongoing harassment. News of the suit spread fast. People on the block started talking, comparing notes, pulling out their own Karen letters, and realizing just how much they'd tolerated without questioning. One woman found 3 different invoices in her garage that she'd shoved aside, confused. A young couple had paid nearly $1,000 over the past year, assuming it was real. The neighborhood had been held hostage by paperwork and noise complaints disguised as law. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about restoring everyone's peace. Then Karen went on the offensive. She launched a campaign of rebuttal, posting to the neighborhood message board daily with updates, rebuttals, and rants. She accused me of spreading misinformation, called Lexi a corporate enforcer, and said she was being bullied by anarchists. Her longest post was titled "The Fall of Decency" and included hand-drawn diagrams of what the neighborhood would look like under complete deregulation. Basically a flaming car, a pig, and a house shaped like a clown. Some people responded with concern. Others responded with memes. Someone printed her drawing on a t-shirt. I didn't comment, didn't respond. I just kept collecting it all. The court date approached fast. Karen filed a motion to dismiss, which was denied. She then tried to file a countersuit for community destabilization, which the clerk reportedly laughed at. Lexi prepped me for court like a general planning for siege. "You'll only need to say a few things," she told me. "I'll do the rest. Just tell the truth. And don't react no matter what she says." The morning of the hearing, the courtroom was unusually full. A few neighbors had come to watch. The local news had even sent someone. Thanks to The public documents getting picked up by a regional blog. Karen entered wearing a navy suit with gold trim, and brought a rolling suitcase of documents and props, including her speakerphone. The judge looked immediately exhausted. Lexi stood, stated the case, presented our documentation with cold efficiency. She spoke of the fake invoices, the harassment, the trespassing, and the impersonation of legal authority. She showed the footage, the neighborhood map, the emails, the flyers. Karen tried to interject, but the judge warned her once and then told her to sit down. When it was Karen's turn, she launched into a speech about order and values, about community structure and moral responsibility. She referenced the Romans, then the speakerphone, lips pressed tight. Karen didn't speak to me for exactly 4 days after the court ruling, which was the longest recorded silence from her since I moved in. During those brief, almost tranquil days, I allowed myself to imagine that perhaps, just maybe, she had absorbed the reality that her full legal empire had finally collapsed for good. But people like Karen don't simply give up. They mutate. And on the 5th day, just as I was organizing my shed, a teenager from down the street jogged up my driveway with an odd look on his face and a flyer in his hand. It was printed in bright, frantic colors and titled Reclaiming Community Integrity, Karen's Call to Civic Awakening. Beneath it was a grainy photo of her standing beside a plastic podium in her front yard, pointing at what appeared to be a chalkboard labeled New Constitution. I read the first paragraph and had to sit down. She was attempting to start a new version of the HOA, this time with a rebranded title, calling it the Oak and Pine Civic Preservation League, and the flyer insisted that while previous regulations had been misunderstood, this version would enlist all neighborhood residents in shared moral guardianship. I checked the cameras. There she was, 4:43 a.m., dragging my trash bins down the street in her pajamas like a determined sleepwalker on a mission. She turned the corner and vanished out of frame. I called waste management to report stolen containers, and the man on the phone actually laughed when I told him what the footage showed. He said, "Sir, I don't mean to joke, but you might be in a sitcom." I wasn't laughing. My front yard tire by noon. Then came the anonymous letters, not emails, not phone calls, but handwritten letters folded in half and shoved under my doormat or through the mailbox slot. Most were in the same looping cursive and used phrases like community health and unruly energy. One even accused me of being a public safety hazard for not trimming my hedges into symmetrical shape. I started collecting them in a shoebox labeled evidence. At this point, I felt like a one-man episode of a true crime podcast, minus the murder, and plus a lot of geranium-related threat. Lexi told me to stay calm. She said, people like Karen thrive on escalation, on dragging you into the emotional mud where they feel most at home. But I wasn't built for patience. I was a man who read every manual before assembling furniture and sorted my junk drawer monthly. My entire life was structured, deliberate, and clean. Karen was chaos in wedge heels. Still, I tried to follow Lexi's advice. I avoided Karen. Didn't return the glares, didn't respond to the baiting letters. I mowed my lawn, paid my bills, waved at other neighbors, and for about 3 days, things were quiet. Then I got a bill from the HOA. Not a notice, not a threat, an actual invoice. It had a letterhead and everything. It said I owed $1,872 for the following: for unpaid quarterly dues, late penalties, non-compliance charges, HOA legal processing fees, and 1 community unity enhancement search charge. I stared at it so long I forgot to blink. It had a QR code for payment. She had made it real. She built a fake invoice system with a payment portal and tried to collect money like she ran a municipal government. I handed it to Lexi. She raised both eyebrows and said, "You've got to be kidding me." Then she leaned in and smiled. Let's give her exactly what she wants. A fight, but one. She can't win. That's when we started building the counteroffensive. Lexi drafted a formal cease and desist letter addressed to Karen to her fake HOA board. And to the email address listed on the invoice portal. We sent copies to the county clerk, the district court, and the property zoning department. We attached copies of my deed, the neighborhood map, and a list of all the recorded incidents so far from the dead plant on my porch to the trash bin heist. We filed a harassment complaint with the sheriff's office and requested a formal investigation into possible mail fraud. The next time Karen showed up on my lawn to take a photo of my recycling bins, I stepped out with a mug of coffee and said, "Smile for the sheriff." She paused mid-snap, scowled, and walked off without a word. Later that day, my internet went out. Coincidence? I thought so at first, but when I checked the cable box outside, the lid was popped open and the cord had been snipped. I filed another report. The neighbors started getting curious. I noticed glances from across driveways. People whispering behind hedges. One afternoon, a woman I'd never spoken to knocked on my door holding a lemon pie and a look of apology. Her name was Diane. She'd lived here 10 years. She said, "We all thought you were part of the HOA when you moved in. Karen told us you joined voluntarily. Said you were passionate about regulation." I nearly choked. Diane went on, "Then you didn't show up to meetings and she told us you were having a breakdown. That's when she started printing those flyers." I asked, "What flyers?" She handed me one. It was a printed bulletin titled "The Truth About the Blue House," featuring a pixelated photo of my face, a list of made-up violations, and a request that neighbors maintain emotional distance until the non-compliant homeowner seeks help. It was surreal. I asked how many people received this. Diane said, "I think most of the block." But after that court case, people started asking questions. Some of us are realizing she's not quite well. That was the moment it shifted. For the first time since moving in, someone stood on my porch and didn't try to intimidate me, fine me, or insult my shrubs. She offered pie. I took it inside and laughed into the crust. Then came the camera. I installed motion-activated surveillance around my house. I didn't want to, but after the snipped internet line and the missing bins, I needed insurance. And within 2 nights, it paid off. Karen was caught sneaking onto my lawn at 2:13 a.m. holding a clipboard, a measuring tape, and a flashlight. She measured the height of my garden box, muttered something about excessive zucchini, then took a photo, and fled when my porch light clicked on. I downloaded the footage, timestamped in clear, and sent it to the sheriff's office with a note that read, "Still not a member." They called me the next day and confirmed that an officer would be visiting her for a warning. It wasn't an arrest, but it was something. The best part came a few days later. Karen decided to go big. She hosted a public HOA meeting in the neighborhood park pavilion. Fold-out chairs, banners, a projector screen. I watched from across the street as maybe a dozen residents showed up, mostly out of curiosity. Karen stood in front of a slideshow labeled "Reclaiming Our Neighborhood" and started listing grievances, fence height violations, vehicle non-compliance, porch clutter, color scheme clashes. I wasn't the only target anymore. People started shifting uncomfortably in their seat. One man raised his hand and asked, "Wait, when did this become a real thing? I thought it was just informal." Karen snapped, "There is nothing informal about order." Another woman asked, "How come we never voted on any of this?" Karen ignored her. That's when Lexi showed up, heels clicking, papers in hand. She walked straight to the front, addressed the crowd, and said, "Just a reminder to everyone here. This association is unregistered and unrecognized by the county. Any enforcement actions taken under its name are legally void. Also, distributing fake invoices can be considered fraud." Karen sputtered, tried to talk over her, but the crowd started to shift. Someone stood up, then another. One man called out, "I didn't sign anything." A woman near the back shouted, "You tried to fine me for having wind chimes." It collapsed fast. Karen packed up her projector with trembling hands and stormed off without another word. That night, I sat on my porch, dog at my feet, drinking the last of the lemonade Diane had dropped off earlier. The stars were out, the street was quiet, and my mailbox stood proudly unpainted in all its wooden glory. When a clipboard-wielding neighbor declares war on my mailbox, I discover my new home sits outside her HOA's iron grip, unleashing a battle of wills that turns a quiet suburb into a battleground of freedom, pie, and one very persistent woman in a cape. The woman screaming outside my kitchen window at 7:12 in the morning wasn't just any neighbor. She was the self-declared president of an HOA I never joined, wearing a sash she'd made from an old bedsheet and duct tape that read neighborhood order enforcer. She was shaking a clipboard at my herb garden like it had insulted her personally. My dog barked once, unsure whether to protect me or go back to sleep. I was barefoot in pajama pants holding a coffee mug that said, "I do what I want." When she pointed at my driveway and yelled, "You have exactly 48 hours to repaint your mailbox or face legal action." That would have been wild enough if I hadn't moved in just 2 days ago. But the real kicker, my property wasn't even in her HOA, and I had the deed to prove it. She just didn't know that yet. And I wasn't about to tell her. Not yet. Because watching her implode was starting to feel like the best part of my morning routine. I'd bought the house on a whim. It was a clean slice of land just past the city limit, a little detached from the rest of the subdivision, with a wide porch, a cedar fence, and enough space to breathe. I moved in thinking peace was finally achievable. What I didn't expect was a woman named Karen. Yes, literally Karen, showing up on my doorstep with a print out of rules from a homeowners association I'd never signed up for. She wore a red blazer, wedge heels, and a smirk like she ran a country instead of a cul-de-sac. "Welcome," she said that first day, handing me a stapled packet. "Here are the HOA codes. You're responsible for quarterly dues, mailbox uniformity, fence paint approval, and trash bin visibility. I'll need your signature by Monday." I looked at her, then at the deed in my hand, which clearly showed my parcel excluded from all HOA jurisdiction. I smiled and said, "No thanks." She blinked like I'd spoken an ancient curse. The next day, I got a citation notice taped to my front door. According to her, my porch furniture wasn't aesthetically compliant. It was a $150 fine. The day after that, another note arrived claiming my grass was too tall. Mind you, I just had it mowed. On the third day, I walked out to find a homemade sign staked into my front lawn that read "Non-compliant resident." I didn't pull it up. I just installed a camera and poured myself another coffee. I figured she'd get tired eventually, but instead, she escalated. By the following week, I received a certified letter from a law office called Oak and Pine Neighborhood Council listing 6 alleged violations and demanding $5,000 in back dues and fees. It said I'd been a member of the HOA the moment I moved in under a clause called implied territorial compliance. I read it 3 times. My lawyer, Lexi, read it once and snorted. "This is garbage," she said, holding up the letter like it smelled. You're not in their territory. There's no clause like this in your sale contract. She's bluffing badly. But it didn't stop there. Karen started holding meetings across the street with her HOA board, sitting in plastic lawn chairs like they were Supreme Court justices. They held clipboards and binoculars, taking notes as I trimmed hedges or parked my truck a few inches to the left. One evening, a neighbor passed by and whispered, "You're brave," before scurrying off. Another dropped off cookies with a sticky note that read, "You didn't hear this from me, but she tried this on the Simmons family last year." They moved. That's when I started digging. County land records, subdivision maps, archived neighborhood charters. I pulled everything I could find, and sure enough, the lines were clear. My home was built on an independent lot carved out a year before the HOA was established. The original owner had negotiated a separation, and the language on the deed was ironclad. This property shall remain exempt from all future associations or neighborhood regulatory groups. I smiled as I printed it out. I framed a copy and hung it in my hallway. 2 days later, I came home to find a crowd in my yard. Karen was standing on my porch, reading from a piece of paper like it was the Constitution. Due to repeated violations and refusal to comply, she said loudly, "This homeowner is hereby being brought before the Neighborhood Order Board for adjudication." She handed me a summon-looking document with a court date stamped on it. "You're being sued," she declared, eyes blazing, "for hostile non-participation." I laughed so hard I choked on my gum. "See you in court," I said. The courtroom was small, tucked inside the county municipal building with mismatched chairs and buzzing fluorescent lights. Karen showed up with a rolling suitcase full of binders and a laminated poster board titled HOA Harmony in Peril. She wore the same red blazer and an air of righteous fury. Her lawyer, a weary man in a wrinkled tie, looked like he was reconsidering all his life choices. I sat beside Lexi, who had 3 pieces of paper, my deed, the neighborhood boundary map, and a copy of the county zoning letter. She leaned over and whispered, "I'm going to enjoy this." The judge came in with coffee and an annoyed look. Karen stood immediately. "Your Honor, this homeowner has repeatedly endangered our community cohesion by refusing to follow mandatory HOA guidelines." The judge raised one eyebrow. "Are they in your HOA?" Karen flinched, hesitated, then said, "They're not currently signed on, but the house resides within the moral boundaries of the what?" The judge interrupted. Lexi handed over our document. "This house is outside their boundaries by over 300 feet. The HOA doesn't cover the property." The judge squinted at the paperwork. "You're suing someone for not following rules that don't apply to them." Karen tried to speak again, but the judge held up a hand. "Case dismissed with prejudice." Then he chuckled. "Moral boundaries. That's a new one." As we walked out of the courtroom, Karen hissed, "You think this is over? You just wait." I smiled and said, "I've got all the time in the world." But in the back of my mind, I knew she wasn't going to stop. Not yet. Because when people like Karen lose in front of a crowd, they don't retreat. They regroup. And judging by the look on her face, she was already planning her next move. My mailbox might survive the week, but I doubted my sanity would if she started again. One thing was for sure, though. I was done being polite. If she wanted a neighborhood war, she just declared it on the wrong porch. I didn't expect the second wave to hit so quickly, but then again, people like Karen don't like being told no, especially not by a courtroom and a boundary map. The day after the judge dismissed the case, I woke up to find my trash bins missing, just gone. No wind. No raccoons, no late-night racetrack teenagers. It said they were working on a limited docuseries about neighborhood disputes and were interested in covering my story. At first, I thought it was a prank, but the letter was legit. They'd found court transcripts, seen the local news segments, and had apparently stumbled upon Karen's now dormant podcast, which they described as compelling raw material. I nearly dropped my tea. I called Lexi, who at this point was less my lawyer and more my partner in absurdity. Her laugh on the other end of the line echoed so hard it set off her dog. She read the letter twice, then said, "Of course they want this. It's like Parks and Rec met Judge Judy." I wasn't sure I wanted my life turned into entertainment, but the idea that Karen might one day see a dramatized reenactment of her Shudder Harmony initiative on a streaming platform almost made it worth it. Word spread fast. Diane knocked on my door the next day, grinning like she'd won the lottery. "Are we going to be famous?" she asked, already imagining who would play her in the reenactments. She said she hoped for someone with warmth and pie energy. Other neighbors chimed in. One offered to build a mock-up of Karen's cape for the production crew. Someone else said they had an archive of old HOA flyers they'd saved, just in case the Smithsonian ever called. Suddenly, the entire neighborhood was alive again, not just with normalcy, but with joy. And, unlike before, this wasn't driven by fear or obligation. It was a collective exhale followed by laughter, the kind that only comes when you've all survived the same strange chapter and are now standing in the afterglow of peace. Karen, to no one's surprise, did not find the documentary idea amusing. The first public mention of it on the neighborhood message board was met with her furious response. A long post titled "Exploitation of Grief," in which she claimed her years of work had been misrepresented through a lens of bias and suburban hysteria. She warned that any unauthorized use of her image or voice would be met with legal action. Lexi, after wiping tears of laughter from her eyes, calmly reminded the board that Karen had put her own podcast into the public domain and that everything in the court record was publicly accessible. Still, Karen's threats continued for a few days. Posts filled with phrases like character defamation, personal persecution, and ideological suppression. No one responded. And when no one responded, she eventually stopped. What followed was the most beautiful kind of transformation. Not dramatic or symbolic, just small changes that mattered. People stopped checking their yards every morning in fear of being cited. Mailboxes stayed crooked. Wind chimes stayed noisy. Front porches gained personality. Kids left their bikes leaning on fences without worrying someone would file a complaint. Someone painted their garage door with a mural of sunflowers and no one batted an eye. I planted tomatoes in my front planter and got compliments instead of threats. It became a neighborhood again, not a system, not a regime, just people living next to each other and figuring it out as they went. And what had once been an absurd battle turned into a legend people laughed about at block parties. I heard a kid once say to his friend, "Better not step on that lawn. Karen might wake up." It was said with a grin. The way people talk about myths they no longer fear. Karen didn't leave. She still lived on the corner in the same house with the two straight hedges and perfectly aligned pavers. But she no longer interfered. Her flags came down. Her podcast was deleted. The signs vanished. Sometimes she walked around the block alone, nodding faintly if she passed someone. She even started waving back at me. Not enthusiastically, not warmly, but just enough to acknowledge existence without war. I appreciated that in its own strange way. She never apologized, never admitted fault, but Her silence was its own kind of surrender. I didn't agree to the documentary right away. I sat with it for weeks, thinking it over, weighing the idea of turning my bizarre reality into someone else's entertainment. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that stories like this don't happen in a vacuum. They happen in communities all over with different faces and rules and fights. Maybe someone else was out there being fined for porch wind socks or having daisies too tall for regulation. Maybe if they saw this story, they'd feel less alone. Maybe they'd laugh. Maybe they'd fight back. So I said yes. Not for fame, not for spite, but because sometimes telling your story is how you make peace with it. The film crew came out that summer. Unobtrusive and kind, careful not to sensationalize, but genuinely curious about the humanity behind it all. They interviewed me on the porch with my dog at my feet and the gnome by the mailbox. They spoke to Diane in her kitchen, pie cooling on the windowsill. They talked to neighbors who used to be afraid to put flamingos in their yard. They even asked to speak to Karen, who to my great surprise, agreed. She sat stiffly, wearing a neutral sweater, and talked for nearly an hour. I never saw the footage, but the crew said it was a strangely tender interview. Defensive, yes, but also reflective. She'd come to see in some limited way that her campaign for order had alienated more than it protected. And though she never said the word sorry, she apparently ended her interview with this line: "I just didn't want things to fall apart." And when they asked if she felt like they had, she said no. They just grew differently. The documentary aired in the fall under the title The Street That Said No. It was part humor, part local politics, part meditation on community. People online debated whether I'd overreacted or been a hero. Some praised Karen's commitment to structure. Others called her a suburban dictator. But for me, it didn't matter. What mattered was sitting on the porch with my neighbors when it aired, sharing popcorn and soda, laughing at the reenactments, and reliving the chaos with the distance only time can give. When the credits rolled, Diane raised her cup and said, "To being free." Everyone echoed it. Even from across the street, Karen's porch light flicked.